So now that I have the basic platform for the desk, I'm going to group all these assets together. I'll just hold down Option G and I'll rename this group simply desk. So I want to get started by adding some details to the desk. And the first thing that I'm going to create is I'm going to create just a real simple pen. And so I have a simple reference here. And I think with the basic shapes inside Cinema 4D, I can get most of this pen created. So I'll jump back into Cinema 4D and I'll get started with a cylinder. It seems like a logical shape to get started with. Now, just like I did in the snowman project, I'm making sure that I don't move things along the Z or the X axis at this point. Everything that I create is basically centered in the 3D space, with the exception of moving it up. I'll zoom in, tap the S key, and I'm going to take this way down in terms of its size. Now, I'm concerned about its relative scale amongst its own parts, and so I think that this is probably a good place to start. I didn't even really pay attention to what the values were, what the numbers were, but I can see that I'll just round these values off just a bit, and this will be the basic shape for my pen. So this seems like a reasonable size relative to the desk. May even be a little bit small, or maybe just my desk a little bit too big, but I'll make a pass later to refine all of those details. Now, rather than modeling directly in my desk scene, what I'll do, just like we did in the snowman project, I'm going to take my reference object and I'll copy it. So I have my cylinder, I've copied it. I'll create a new Cinema 4D project and I'll paste the thing that I've copied. Now this is going to act as my pen body. And before I spend too much time modeling this, I'm going to give this a quick save. And when you're working on complex scenes that have a lot of details, it's not a bad idea to model them individually and then combine them back into the scene. We'll take a look at another workflow once we start using layers where we can model inside the same scene. We can suppress and mute some things so that we're not looking at all this different content up on stage. But for now, the best way to handle this is simply create the pen project file inside the desk scene folder. So I'll call that Pen01 and give it a quick save. Now, I'm going to build just a couple of really quick textures, and I'll simply call this pen white. And for now, I'll let that texture color default. And I'll make a pen blue texture. And I'll send that over to the blue spectrum. That looks pretty good. And I'll say OK. So I'll throw the white texture on, and now I'll start to think about the cap. And as far as the cap goes, I want to jump back out and constantly refer to this. And what I think I can do is I'm pretty sure using either cylinders or even cones and some cubes, I think I'm able to create most of the details of this pen cap. Now, there are a couple of details in here that I'm not sure that I'm going to bother with. There's a little bit of a bevel here in the pen. And I think there's going to be so much stuff on my desk that I'm not so concerned about every little detail. I just want to get close and suggest the rough shape for the cap. So I'll jump back in to Cinema 4D and I'll choose a cone object. And the reason that I'm choosing the cone, at least I think I'm going to stick with the cone, is that it'll give me the ability to taper this object pretty quickly. So I'm just going to make it a little bit smaller. I'll take that top radius in. And I'm looking at the pen body just to reference its radius. And so its radius is 6, so I know that the top radius should be at least 6, and the bottom radius should be something like maybe 8. Okay? And I'll just kind of raise that object up. I'll tap the S key to zoom in. It's a little tall, but already it's starting to take shape. So I'll take that cap down. And again, I'm not really paying attention at this point to the exact number of the height. I'm just taking a look at how that looks relative to the rest of the pen. That looks pretty good. So I'm going to throw my blue texture on my cone object, and I'll call this pen cap top, because there's going to be some different parts to the cap. So the next thing that I'll do is rather than spending too much time trying to model some of the details down here, I could either cheat with this cap that I'm starting with, or I could take just a simple cylinder. And I think I'll borrow this cap, and I'll do a quick copy and paste. Let's try that again. Select it, copy and paste. There we go. And I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. So I'm going to take the top radius and I'll bump that out to 8, maybe 9. I'll make the bottom radius about the same for now. I'm going to take the height way down and I'll kind of stick that down towards the bottom end of the cap. Now it feels a little heavy. It feels like I'm getting a little too big there, so I'll take in this this bottom radius. I'll take this down to 8 and 8, and that seems like, you know, it's not quite pronounced enough. And so this is the point where I'm getting into modeling with decimals, and it's not a big deal when I need to, you know, kind of find the difference between two whole values. Not really a big deal. But if we modeled this to scale and set our desk to, you know, a few hundred centimeters, we would definitely find ourselves at the point where we're modeling this pen, that we're just kind of really working down at these fractional. Everything becomes a decimal, and it's much easier to control. So I feel like that's, you know, a pretty good rough size and shape for this. I'll just finish this off by throwing a cube into the equation. And I'm going to take all the values down really low. And I'll just lift this up, and then I'll move it over along the X. Now, I made it really small along the Y just so I could, you know, kind of have a really small object to work with. And now I'll start playing with some of these values. And I think by using this cube, I could make this clip object out of it. So I'll take the Z value down. And it's okay if you're still trying to figure out which one's the X and the Y. After this project, you'll definitely have a clear idea of how you've moved this and how you're starting to manipulate it. So just by playing with these values, I'm taking them down, and I'm really just paying attention to how that looks relative to the rest of the cap. And I'll just kind of sneak that object in there. And that looks pretty good. So I'll throw this on. I'll call this object pen clip. Remember, I'm trying to stay as organized as possible. And I think as far as the cap goes, that feels pretty good. That's the rough shape. Now I could get into some of the real fine details here. You know, I could kind of taper this edge and put some angles and some bevels on this, but I think this pen is going to be so small relative to the rest of the scene that those kinds of details aren't so important. Now I do want to finish off the end of the pen, and in order to do this, to build the business end of the pen here where all the writing happens, I'm going to take a look at some other modeling tools inside Cinema 4D. So I'll jump back in. I want to give my pen a quick save. Now, in order to get, there's this blue plastic piece in this reference down here. There's this kind of taper that's happening. It's not quite a cone, and it's not quite a cylinder. I want to create a very unique shape here. And the way that I'm going to do this is inside Cinema 4D, I can start to leverage building more complex shapes by combining splines with different kinds of NURBS. Now, we've already looked at the HyperNURBS object, and the HyperNURBS is this object that's applied to 3D models to kind of smooth them out, but there's different kinds of NURBS hiding in here. We're specifically going to look right now at the lathe NURBS, and the way that a lathe NURBS works, I'll jump into a new document to demonstrate this. The way that a lathe NURBS works is it takes a profile shape. So if I just generate something like, let's start with a freehand shape, and I'll do this. It's really important that when you're lathing content, you always want to start in the front viewport. And what I'll do is I'll just click and hold in the splines menu, and you can see that there's a bunch of different orange splines, and these are all open-ended splines that need to be created with the pen tool. It works very similar to Illustrator and some of the vector tools inside Photoshop. And then there are these these pre-existing shapes, and they have things like circle. These are parametric splines, like circle, helix, text, etc. And the difference between the two is if I choose, let's say, an n-gon, that object is a parametric primitive. It's a two-dimensional spline. If I were to render this, I actually don't see two-dimensional splines by default inside Cinema 4D. But the minute that I combine it with a NURB generator, I can generate a specific shape based on it. Let me get rid of my n-gon for just a moment and go and choose one of these maybe a freehand spline. Now, when I create a freehand spline, I'm going to go into the front viewport. It's really important that we do this in the front viewport. And I'll just click and drag and draw a profile shape. Now, because I've created this in the front viewport, this spline is projected along the y-x axis. Okay, and it's very predictable. I know exactly where it exists in space. If I jump into my perspective viewport for a moment and I try to draw a similar shape in the perspective viewport, it may look kind of good inside the perspective viewport, but when I look at it through all the different views, you can see that it's not registered here. It's not sitting flat along Z or X. It's kind of twisted in space in the right view, and the front view is kind of all over the place. So whenever you create a custom spline, make sure that you're doing it in the front viewport. The only exception to that is if you're using these parametric splines. By default, these splines, I'll just generate this rectangle spline, has a plane that it's registered to, and in this case it's XY, which means that if I look at this and I look at the Y, X, I'll zoom in on this, I'll tap the S key so we can see this. It's kind of hard to see in this view, so I'll do a quick shading with lines in this view. And I still can't see it because it's just sitting right here on top of this grid and it's almost invisible until I project a 3D shape on it. Now, let me get rid of all these splines. Now that you've got a chance to play around with a couple of these different kinds of splines, what I want to do is I want to grab the freehand spline. I want to make sure I go into the front viewport, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a lathe object and combine it with the spline, and that'll generate our 2D shape. And the lathe is going to operate on the Y-axis. And the basic idea of a lathe is that if we draw a profile shape, and I'll just kind of draw a real quick shape, and if we go back under the NURBS menu and choose lathe NURBS, if we take the spline and drop it inside the lathe NURBS, you can see that we create a shape that revolves around the Y-axis, and that profile shape generates a 3D shape. So we can make things like, a baseball bat, a wine glass. We can make these pretty complex shapes. Now, the really cool thing about NURB objects is that this generator is generating a 3D shape based on this spline. I could select the spline and I could do a number of things with it. In fact, I can edit it in real time. And if I want to, if I just uncheck the lathe NURBS, that temporarily turns it off. I can go in and select a point. Oops, I just generated some more splines. If I have my spline selected and I grab the move tool and I select one of these points, I can slide that spline point around. And if I turn back on my lathe NURBS, you can see that I can actually affect this object in real time. So I could create, a real custom shape. You may have also noticed that when I grab these different points, if I zoom in on it, you can see that we get these curve handles, or these Bezier handles, and I can click and drag, and just like in Illustrator, I can really control how that line travels into that point and how it exits that point to determine my curve. Now, I'm going to trash this whole object, and I'll try this again. Now remember, the lathe object uses the Y-axis as its registration point. So if I jump back into my freehand tool, and if I'm trying to create a shape like something like a baseball bat, and I'll just do this really roughly, and I draw a profile shape, so I kind of have half this bat object. If I throw that into my lathe object, drag and drop the spline into lathe, the shape is much bigger than I intended it to be, and that's because it's using that Y-axis to revolve around. So the further my spline is away from that Y-axis registration point, the bigger the wider the object's going to be. You also notice that if I look down in this object, there's a big hole inside my object that I can look down into. Now, I can just kind of spin this around and look down into it. Now, if I turn off my lathe object, it should start to be obvious what's happening here. This object is sent around the Y-axis. It's revolved around the Y-axis to project that 3D shape. So if I selected the spline and I went into model mode with the move tool, as I move that spline closer to the Y-axis, you can see that a couple things happen. One, that profile shape starts to get smaller. And then two, you can see that the top of the object starts to close up.